Have you ever noticed how sometimes when you're designing something on the computer, it's like
It's a battle.
the elements just,
Pixels fighting?
yeah,
That,
they just won't behave. And it's like they're playing Tetris in a box or something.
yeah, it's like you're trying to impose order on chaos.
Exactly.
But thankfully, there are tools to help us wrangle those pixels into submission.
Right. And that is what we are diving into today
Yes.
with Tkinter's grid system.
Your blueprint for layout.
We've got articles, we've got tutorials all about Tkinter Grid and how to use it.
It's all about rows and columns, just like a spreadsheet.
Okay.
So you can visualize your layout.
So right off the bat, when I was going through the materials you sent, one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me was this idea of a sticky attribute. And I don't know why, but just the name sticky, it sounds messy.
It's deceptively simple, actually.
Okay.
So imagine you've designed this beautiful interface.
Okay.
And then
Anonymized and organized.
exactly. And then someone resizes the window and suddenly everything's crammed into a corner.
Oh, I've seen that happen.
Right, so the sticky attribute lets you control how elements stick to the edges of their grid cells when the window size changes.
So it's kind of like magnets or something.
Exactly. Think of it like you're using compass directions north, south, east, west
Okay.
to tell each element where to stick.
So if I wanted like a button to always stay on the right side of its cell, I would use
You would use sticky equals E for east.
sticky equals E. Got it.
And that way, no matter how the window size changes, your button stays glued to that right edge.
That is so smart.
Yeah. Right. No more layout disasters.
I can already see how many problems this solves.
It's a lifesaver.
Okay, so we've got sticky elements, but then there's also this idea of column span, which,
Yes, column span. It's like merging cells in a spreadsheet.
okay, I was going to say it sounds very spreadsheet-esque.
Exactly. Let's say you have a heading that needs to span across 2 columns. Column span lets you do just that.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's great for creating visual hierarchy in your layouts.
And I actually saw a really good example of this in one of the code snippets you shared,
Oh, yeah. Which one?
where they were making a form, I think.
Yes, the form example.
And they used column span to make the labels line up with the entry fields.
Exactly. It made the whole layout so much cleaner and easier to understand.
Yes. And speaking of things that can make your layout messy,
Oh. What have you found now?
I remember reading something about not mixing grid layouts with something called pack.
Yes, you want to be careful about that.
Is that like a recipe for disaster or something?
It can be. It's like trying to fit square blocks and round pegs into the same box. It just doesn't work very well. You really should stick to one system per window, either grid or pack.
Okay, so grid for structure, pack for something else.
Pack is more for a free-flowing layout.
Free-flowing, okay.
But when you mix them, you're asking for trouble. You'll end up with elements appearing in unexpected places, overlapping each other, a real headache.
So pick your layout manager and stick with it.
Exactly. Consistency is key.
Got it. So we've covered some really great basic concepts so far.
Yeah, we've got sticky elements, we've got column span.
But I know from the materials that we can get even more control over the spacing and positioning.
Oh, absolutely. We're just scratching the surface here.
Okay, good, because I was wondering about IPACs and paddocks.
Yes, the padding attributes. These are your tools for fine-tuning the look and feel of your layouts.
So it's getting into the visual design side of things a little bit more.
Exactly. iPad and paddocks control the spacing around your elements.
Okay, but are they both for spacing or?
They are both for spacing, but in slightly different ways.
Okay, I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Think of it like this iPadX adds padding inside an element's grid cell, while paddocks adds padding outside the grid cell.
Oh, okay. So one is for the element's own personal space, and the other one is for
Exactly.
its relationships with its neighbors.
iPadX is for breathing room. paddocks is for elbow room.
I love that. Okay, so that makes perfect sense.
It's all about those subtle visual cues that make a big difference in the overall aesthetic.
Okay, now there's one more thing I wanted to ask about before we move on.
Okay, sure.
What is grid size all about? Is that like the overall size of the grid?
It's a little sneakier than that. Think of it more as a way to figure out how many rows and columns are actually being used.
Even if some of them are empty?
Even if they're empty. Because remember, you might have elements that span multiple rows or columns.
Right.
So grid size gives you the real dimensions of your layout.
It's like taking inventory of your grid.
Exactly. Making sure you know what you're working with.
So you don't accidentally build something on top of something else.
Exactly. You don't want any layout collisions.
Layout collisions, like that. Okay, so that makes sense. Grid size is important.
Very important.
And I think that's a great place to take a quick break.
Sounds good to me.
We'll be back in a moment to talk about even more cool stuff with Tkinter Grid.
Don't go anywhere.
It's amazing how Just thinking in terms of these rows and columns can make your UI so much more organized.
Structure is key.
It is. It's like you said before, a blueprint.
Exactly. And just like a good blueprint, a grid layout can scale with you.
Right. Like it'll work whether you're building something simple
Right.
or something really complex.
Exactly. Imagine building a dashboard with tons of charts and graphs.
Or like image editing software.
All those panels and toolbars, grids,
Grids behind the scenes.
silently keeping everything in its place.
I never thought about it like that, but it's true.
They're the unsung heroes of many great UIs.
Okay, so speaking of UIs, one of the articles you sent talk about using Tkinter's Canvas widget with a grid layout,
Ah, yes, the canvas.
which I thought was interesting because Canvas is usually for drawing and graphics and stuff.
It is, but it can also be a powerful tool for data visualization when combined with a grid.
Okay, so how does that work? You
Yeah.
just like stick a canvas inside a grid cell.
Exactly. You can dedicate a grid cell to house a canvas widget, and then within that canvas, you can draw anything you want.
So you get the structure of the grid
Right.
combined with the flexibility of Canvas.
It's a match made in GUI heaven.
That's a good way to put it.
Imagine you're building an app that needs to display data in a visually appealing way.
Yeah.
You could use the grid to lay out the basic structure, a header, a sidebar, a main content area, and then in that main content area, you could have a canvas widget.
Where you're drawing charts and graphs and stuff.
Precisely. Or how about an interactive map?
Oh, that's a good idea.
The grid keeps everything organized, and then you have this dedicated space within the grid where you can draw and manipulate the map elements using the canvas.
Okay, so we've got these two systems working together in perfect harmony.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about another concept we haven't talked about yet, anchoring.
Ah, yes, anchoring. That's all about positioning elements within their grid cells.
Is it like the sticky attribute?
They're related but different. Sticky determines which edge of the cell an element sticks to,
Right,
while anchoring controls where the element sits within its cell.
especially the cell's bigger than the element.
Exactly. Like imagine a button inside a really wide grid cell.
Yeah.
Anchoring lets you control whether that button is centered in the cell or aligned to one of the corners.
So if I wanted it to hug the bottom right corner,
You would use anchor equals southeast.
southeast, got it.
And no matter how the cell resizes, the button stays put in that bottom right corner.
That's really helpful
It is. It's all about that visual consistency we talked about earlier.
for making sure everything looks polished and intentional.
Exactly. You want your users to focus on the content, not the layout.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about positioning, but what about actually making things happen when the user interacts with our interface?
Ah, you're talking about events.
Events, is that the right word?
Yes. Events are how we make our interfaces dynamic and responsive.
Okay, so how do events work with a grid layout?
It's all about binding functions to specific events.
Binding functions to events.
Yes. For example, you can bind a function to the button click event.
So when the user clicks the button,
The function is executed.
okay, that makes sense.
And that function can do anything you want.
Like update a label?
Yes, or open a new window.
Or even send data to a server.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless.
I'm starting to see how powerful this can be.
It's like we're giving our interfaces a brain.
So they can react and respond to the user.
Exactly. And that's what makes them truly interactive and engaging.
It's like we're conducting this orchestra of interactive elements.
And the grid is our conductor.
It is. I like that analogy a lot because it can get pretty complex.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you start thinking about dynamic layouts.
Right. And speaking of dynamic layouts,
Yes.
one of the articles mentioned using loops to actually create the grid layout itself.
Oh, yes. Loops are a lifesaver when it comes to building more intricate grids.
So instead of placing each element individually, you can
You can automate the process.
automate it. Okay.
Imagine you're building a calendar app.
Okay.
Instead of manually creating a grid cell for each day of the month,
Right.
you could use nested loops to generate the entire calendar
Oh,
structure.
that is smart.
Each iteration of the loop would create a new cell representing a day.
So much faster than doing it manually.
Way faster. And it makes your code much more concise and readable.
Okay, so loops are great for efficiency.
Absolutely.
But what about when you need to make changes to the layout later on?
That's where careful planning comes in.
Okay.
If you know you'll need to update specific elements frequently, you'll want to design your loops and element naming conventions in a way that makes those elements easy to access.
So it's still manageable even with all the automation.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between efficiency and maintainability.
Right. You don't want to make it impossible to update your UI later on.
Exactly. Because let's face it, UIs are never truly finished, are they?
They're always evolving,
Always
and
evolving.
just like our understanding of how to build them.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it?
It's like this constant process of learning and experimenting and refining.
And with tools like Tkinter's grid system.
We have the power to bring our UI visions to life.
Exactly. So go forth and create those pixel-perfect layouts.
Yes, and don't be afraid to experiment and try new things.
Absolutely. The more you explore, the more you'll discover what's possible.
And who knows, maybe you'll even discover some new tricks and techniques that we haven't even talked about today.
The world of UI design is full of surprises.
That is so true.
Oh.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
As always, it's been a pleasure chatting with you and learning from your expertise.
Until next time.
Until next time.